My name is Jason.
And my name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we're floating in a most peculiar way as we step into Hard Light.
Our first segment is the basic crawl. M1 Hard Light is an adventure for the Stars Without Number role-playing game for 4 to 6 characters of levels 1 through 3. It was written by Kevin Crawford, with cover art by Ilse Gariv, interior art by Inovari and Serge Zastavkin. We are told that a killing light shines on the graves of a lost race in the Hard Light system. Can the adventurers survive the treacherous corridors of Brightside Station and the perils of the ancient sky tombs? The contents of the book begin with a section called Light Without End. This gives us the backstory of Brightside Station, a mining station in the Hard Light system where a valuable element, novium, is extracted. This backstory is key to understanding the conflicts that play out later in the module. Next comes a section with some high-level details about Brightside Station: personnel, laws and regulations, navigating the station, novium mining, and so forth. Then we have Faces of Brightside, where we learn about the significant NPCs. Then comes the Brightside Station Plans, which consists of 3 areas and associated keyed locations: the low-deck facilities, the mid-deck facilities, and the high-deck facilities. Then we have a short section on Brightside Space and its hazards.
Next up are the Sky Tombs. These are long abandoned, or long ago built at any rate, graves built within asteroids floating around in the system. And first off, we get the history of 2 species involved in their construction, the Ushans and the Chitik. Then we have creating a sky tomb. That's his guidelines on how to map out and stock these locations. And there is then a section on Ushan Xenotech, some items of hyper-advanced science from an age gone by. Next we have 3 pre-made Sky Tomb dungeons, each larger than the last. First is Empty Graves, which is in fact now a pirate lair. Then the Cold Tomb, which is not. And finally the House of Echoes. And from there we get a scenario, Judgment Day, which involves the politics and drama around Brightside Station. Then comes Nothing But Trouble, which is a series of plot hooks. And the book is rounded out with NPC combat stats, maps, including some tomb geomorphs, and a system registry handout for the players.
Let's talk about how we have used this in our gaming, Tom.
I ran a 3-hour one-shot of this using the Orbital Blues system, which we've spoken about previously. In that time, we were able to visit the main station, Brightside, and have an expedition to the Cold Tomb.
I have only read it. Let's talk about things we liked about Hard Light. I'm going to say at a really just sort of high level, I really, really enjoy the writing of this module. I think the module's popularity is a testament to the quality of the writing, because let's face it, the module is not a looker, but the writing is so good and so captivating. I was pulled in like almost from the jump, and I don't even really like space science fiction stuff, but I was really, really pulled in. So just at a really high level for me, the quality of the writing is so top notch and worth picking up for that reason alone, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. You're right that it's not a looker. It's also quite crammed to the gills in a way that's maybe not easy to get into, but as you say, once you start reading a section, you do start to get drawn in. And they're all quite different sections. I do appreciate how we have that kind of gritty space mining thing going on at a Brightside Station, but then when you get over to the Sky Tombs, you're back in the land of travelers, ancient ones, or whatever they were called, and your sort of noble space wizards races, essentially. Not 2 different genres, but they're 2 quite different ends of the hard sci-fi spectrum. Yeah, and that is well sort of set up. That it's a good little kind of Keep on the Borderlands thing going on there. You've got the station as your home base.
Mm-hmm.
Although actually, compared to Keep on the Borderlands, where the keep is pretty bland. Well, actually, I say that there's a few. There's like a traitor in there, isn't there? But the station is it's pretty bland. The station, though, you could have the adventure could just be on Brightside with the sort of competing factions there. the slightly over complex backstory about embezzlement like 25 years earlier or whatever that was. Although I do also like that, which I think I'll come to later. There's some space pirates a day's journey away, and then you've got your dungeons floating around in the system as well. I think that's all really well assembled. And then there's the overall thing of the deadly space radiation, which is a constant threat that then ties all the locations together.
I was impressed with how much stuff is in these 38 pages. I mean, it is stuffed to the gills. We have all the details about the space station, which it's a sufficiently detailed space. It's not overly detailed like in, say, Leviathan, which that wasn't really overly detailed. It was just a lot. It gives you all the things you need to make the game work. You have a quite interesting history between these two alien species, a dungeon generator, 3 whole-ass dungeons, overarching campaign scenario. There's a lot going on in 38 pages, and every bit of it feels pretty good to me. I think the thing that was most impressive to me about Hard Light is that the whole module has a very strong sense of place, and that comes out in different ways. A few things that stuck out to me: the sailor in me really appreciated the terms that are used for onboard navigation of the bright side. In particular, the terms, I guess, in-by and out-by, or in-by and out-by.
Yeah, I couldn't decide how to say that either. In-by? I feel like in-by sounds more natural, but I don't know, yeah.
But it means an orientation whereby you are walking or you're going towards the system's star rather than away from it. Toward it and away from it, respectively, with in-by and out-by. And the module's really consistent in its use of its various terms like that, right? And I think it really creates a really nice sense of place. Many of the Brightside locations have notes about alternate uses, which again makes it feel like a very believable lived-in space. So, for example, the brothel is also a spillover medical bay. The theater is a shelter in case of a hull breach. And if you've ever spent any amount of time on a ship, and I have, you know that this is how spaces are used. Spaces are used like they have their primary function, but then they have their sort of emergency function. I thought that was really clever, and it made it all feel so good. I'm going to talk more about this in a minute, but I think just the way that these two alien species and the various sky tombs are presented feels so lived in and believable, and have a real strong sense of place in history. It's really impressive.
Yeah, it's good that you call out that doubling up on the use of space and things, because that's true of the crew of Brightside Station as well.
Yes.
Like when you're hiring a ship's crew, you get someone who can, you always have overlap so that if, the navigator loses consciousness, you've got someone else that can operate it. And I think all of the NPCs basically have 2 functions on the station. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that's actually, I hadn't thought about this until just a second ago, but that's thematically true of the Sky Tombs as well. Empty Graves was a tomb. Now it's ostensibly an artist colony, but actually a hideout for pirates, which is pretty good. There's the whole thing of duality, and the fact that the 2 alien species perceived, because they're all extinct now, we think, they perceived those constructions in different ways as well. So that's actually a kind of underlying thread that I didn't notice while playing, but I guess it does tie it together, yeah.
All I had to do was read it, so of course I was picking up on maybe more thematic concerns. Let's talk about the 2 alien species, because I think there's basically 2 big reasons to show up. One is Brightside Station, which is very well realized, and the other is this conflict between these 2 species, the very pacifistic Ushans and these warlike bug creatures, the Chittens, which I think squarely puts Hard Light in the OSR canon, because
bug
we have
people,
bug people,
Oh, and this is a conflict I think we should underscore, that it is long gone, like it was in millennia past.
There's a little remnant in one of the dungeons, but But basically, these 2 races, kind of the short version, listeners, is the Ushans were there already. They went through 3 whole ass millennia long dynasties and created these various sky tombs that are these sort of memorial places for their people. They're very peaceful. They keep to themselves. And then these bug people move in, enslave them, and the Ushans never really fight back. They try at one point, but it doesn't work out so great. But what you end up having, the sort of remnants of this, is these sky tombs, which, depending on which chamber you're in, depending on which sky tomb you're in, you're getting a different perspective on this history, which I think is super fascinating. The sky tombs themselves sort of reinforce these historical details in very cool ways, so that when you read the history, you're kind of primed for it, and then you see it in the actual dungeon as almost a sort of practical application of the history, and it feels really, really great. In one of the sky tombs, the Ushans have built a memorial to essentially like the horrors they've suffered under the Chittics. But the Chittics don't take the memorial down because to them, the memorial confirms something they believe about the Ushans, which is that they are there to be used and trodden upon, right? So it's kind of this interesting, like the way the two different species perceive this. It's like very, very intriguing. It says a lot about them. In another instance, we have this statue garden where the Ushans celebrate lives of important Ushans, and the statues move through various levels of abstraction and detail in their construction, depending on what dynasty they were created in. But in the most recent sort of decline era of the Ushans, the statues are just these roughly shaped pillars with writing on them. And I just find that to be so cool and tragic. It really stuck out to me. The depiction of these two species and the way, and in particular, the way they interact with each other through the remnants of what's left of them is super cool.
Yeah, you've got this quite involved history. I say quite involved, as you mentioned, it's only 38 pages, the whole thing. So
right, yeah.
How involved can it be? But it feels quite detailed.
It feels it.
But that's actually quite good. And that also happens in some other parts. The character backstory I mentioned before. There's this whole thing about going back to Brightside Station and, the modern day things that are going on. The commander or manager of the station is this guy called Yash Dutta, who essentially framed a guy for embezzlement and then took over the station. And so his motivation is really good because it boils down to he does these things that seem self-destructive, like working people to death almost, because he's desperate to keep the mining station running and making money, because if he doesn't, he's going to die, essentially. But the actual details are, well, they're very high stakes, they're quite involved and complicated, and they're also quite boring, which I think is great as well. They're like an actual business dispute, it's like not that
right,
interesting.
Yeah.
As and when the PCs bother to find out what really happened X years ago, you've got it to hand. But you don't need to know from moment to moment what actually happened. You just need to remember Yash Dutta this is the reason he acts like this. So he's not just some kind of hard-ass manager. He's got a slightly different angle on things. That comes through with a lot of the decisions NPCs make. Like there's that sort of thing with the guy who can fly you to the Sky Tombs has a contentious relationship with his wife that isn't quite as straightforward as it seems on the surface. So yeah, it's all these little bits and pieces that work well, I think, in play. And although I haven't tried it, I think would emerge over 2 or 3 sessions as you gradually get to know these people better.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you want to say about things you liked about it?
Yeah, there kind of is, although I think we want to talk about them in the expert delve, but just to tease that a little bit, I want to mention that I think the sci-fi-ness of the locations are really well done. There's the killing radiation that was mentioned in the intro. There's also the fact that the cold tomb, the one that was in the session I ran, is in an asteroid, and it's a dungeon that's completely flooded with dark, freezing cold water that you have to go in your spacesuits, and like that's a very, like, you could do that in a fantasy game, but it would feel very different and not, it would feel very high fantasy and low threat, weirdly, because you'd probably be breathing from a magic shell or something, whereas in this case it feels absolutely terrifying. So it's great for that. And then the other thing is to do with the nature of the Sky Tombs, the fact that they're like a Valley of the Kings sort of situation. I think it's implied that they aren't anywhere else. They're just in this system. So, you show up and you're really discovering things. It's not... I always found the prehistoric ancient master aliens in Traveller a little bit bland because they were everywhere.
Right.
Everywhere you go, they've been here before. Whereas this is like a pocket of genuine discovery. But yeah, maybe more of that later, I think.
Indeed. Well, let's go to questions. I didn't note any down, but it looks like you have maybe 1 or 2.
Well, I do. The layout, I would say, could this be better, or does it need to take up all the space and not really have much in the way of user-friendly headings and so on?
Well, I haven't run it, so I can't say like for sure, but my read of it is, okay, it's not the most amazing layout. I mean, it's not bad. It's just not like particularly inspiring. It's just plain, it has a plainness to it. We talk about this a lot. We sometimes want little bullet points and little graphics and little headers and things that like kind of make information like a little easier to consume. In this case, I give it a pass because the information presented is actually quite compartmentalized. Okay, yes, we're getting a history of these alien species, but it's only a page. Or we're getting like a backstory about the Brightside Station, but it's like 5 or 6 paragraphs. Everything feels nicely cabined off to where this sort of plain, not dynamic layout doesn't really matter as much to me, because there's not as much to keep in mind at once.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. I've kind of put this down as a minor nitpick. I think the one place where someone might be well served by maybe typing up their own version is there is a single page of NPC capsule descriptions for when you're on Brightside Station.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a single page is an excellent size for such a thing to be, and the descriptions are fine, but even on that one page, because all the paragraphs kind of look the same, it was still quite hard to find who I was looking for very quickly.
That makes sense. I think
see that. A bit of different highlighting might help. So then again, you don't want it to go to 2 pages, so there's always that. It's,
right.
It's tricky.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting thing. But I found the simple layout not as troubling as I would or as I have in the past with some of the older modules, because when the older modules had their simpler layouts, they were probably working within certain limitations, for one thing, that we don't have today. But the thing about those older modules is they tended to pack in a lot of information. It was lots and lots of information. I mean, think about that quite detailed backstory of that one Lovecraftian module we covered, the Tinseltown old Hollywood one. That was an incredible amount of information, and it's just it was just like reading a book.
Yeah.
There was no help whatsoever in the layout. This does not feel like that to me, because everything is the writing is fairly concise.
Yeah, that's true. My other question was, about the now extinct aliens. Is it the right amount of text?
I think so.
I couldn't decide. Yeah. I think it is, but I wondered what your read on that was.
It felt good to me. I felt like I had enough information to sort of understand what these two species were about when they were a thing, but I was not overwhelmed by it, and I felt reasonably confident that I could improvise in the sort of blank spaces. I felt okay about that.
They're not cliched, but they're certainly of a familiar type within science fiction.
They do.
You've got your noble pacifists and your bug people. Yeah. So
if you have just any kind of grounding in the genre at all, even a limited amount that I do, I think it probably is going to be okay. Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom, kick it off.
Several dozen relatives made it very clear to Dutter that they were going to kill him for what he had done, whether or not they had proof sufficient for a court of law. Dutter's station became his prison, with him as his own chief jailer.
Of the Brightside Station brothel, the lobby is fitted out in a vaguely faux Japanese style with multicolored plastic paneling and decorative wall paintings. Mirrors cover the aft wall to increase the seeming size of the room, and assorted items of plush pseudo-mahogany furniture are fastened to the station deck. A bar along the aft wall dispenses non-alcoholic drinks and snacks after a credit swipe.
The Sky Tombs were discovered only a scant 2 years ago. The only people who have made a concentrated effort to explore them have been adventurers and freebooters with minimal interest in the society or history of their creators. If the PCs take an interest in the details of the Sky Tombs, it's very possible they will be the first people to actually discover much of the information revealed here.
I like this little bit about the emergency system on Brightside Station. While the station bridge can give potentially lethal commands to the ship's systems, any blatantly unsafe order will be automatically announced to the entire station, and a delay of 5 minutes will be given before the command is carried out. Someone who can retake or override the bridge can then cancel the command. The board is designed to make the cancel lethal order override blatantly obvious even to the least technically proficient onlooker.
In one of the chambers within the cold tomb, which, remember, is entirely underwater, a sluggish pump sets a slow, whirling vortex of decayed synthetic book pages and ring-pierced bindings circling in the darkness of this silted library.
Of the Brightside Station Chapel, which hosts numerous religious faiths, tensions between those faiths are minimal. Troublemakers are assisted into a broader appreciation of ecumenism by Livingston Roy's security personnel, if necessary. Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve. Today we are talking about sci-fi dungeons. Now, I'm going to just say at the outset, science fiction is not really my genre when it comes to role-playing games. I rarely play in it. And so I can't say I personally have a lot of direct experience in making a sci-fi dungeon. However, there are some things that stuck out to me while reading the Sky Tombs and Hardlight that felt important for capturing the feeling of the genre. And so, for my part, I'm going to highlight those things. Tom, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I think I'm coming from kind of the same perspective. It was that moment when I was reading the module and I realised, wait a second, these Sky Tombs are just an elegant cover for dungeons.
Right.
But then when I continued reading the pre-made ones, and then when I actually played through one of them, this observation that, this is actually very sci-fi. It's not just a reskin of a fantasy dungeon.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of my opening observation, is that firstly, you could just reskin a fantasy dungeon, and if that's what you end up with, if you end up with just the Cult of the Reptile God, but they have lasers, that's actually a really great time, and you should maybe not worry about it too much. But
right.
and I started to wonder, what are the things that you can do to do things in a way that's a fun dungeon, but is also taking advantage of what can only be done in a sci-fi or a spacefaring genre,
Before we move on to like a deeper treatment here, I do want to continue our shout out to just basic reskinning. Hardlight seems to sort of acknowledge that dungeons require dungeon trappings, and these trappings aren't just for the sake of like nostalgia or familiarity. There are just certain things in a dungeon that make it a dungeon, like certain types of items and certain types of monsters and things like that. And so Hardlight does do what is basically just a reskin, but it does it in a cool way. A lot of the items, like some of the xenotech of the Ushans, for example, the Everlights are just torches. The glass cable is just lengths of rope. The penitence wraps are invisibility cloaks.
Invisibility cloaks. Although in fairness, those are, I think those are magic items more than they're just dungeon things, aren't they? Because the ropes, you can look down them like a telescope.
Sure.
So they're tricks,
that's fair.
Aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that you can get pretty far with a reskin, though.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't have to be too complex as far as that goes. And even some of the encounters, right? Like some of the encounters could just as easily be like orcs or goblins.
Oh, yeah, the Tomb Guardians are absolutely an evil wizard's golems or whatever. Just animating skeletons, whatever.
So reskins are probably like the easiest thing to do here, and Hardlight does a lot of it. It's done really well. It's done in a really elegant way, but it's ultimately just sort of dungeon reskinning. I picked up on a couple of bigger themes in the Sky Tombs, as I think on it feel very important for a science fiction dungeon. And I'll just kind of name them now, and then we'll maybe discuss them in more detail. But one is that I think you have to pay more attention to the vastness of time when it comes to a science fiction dungeon. Fantasy worlds, of course, take place over millennia. But when you're in a sort of futuristic, technology-rich context, player characters are much more likely to have access to this information about ancient civilizations because of technology or because of science or whatever that will allow them to understand it. And so I think you have to maybe more actively consider the implications of vast, long stretches of time, whereas in a straight fantasy dungeon, you can sort of handwave that or let it reside in the mists of history or mystery. You don't have to be too precise, I feel like. I think maybe you have to be a little more precise in what is happening over this vast space of time.
But also, I think what's good in, for example, dealing with the Ushan tombs is you can have them be vastly ancient and so on and make that verifiably demonstrable, but also then contrast that with the timelessness or almost timelessness of the natural universe around them.
Right, yeah.
So no matter how old those tombs are, which I think, I'm not sure how old it is, it's in the thousands of years, isn't it? But the stars and planets on any maps you find are still, in fact, you do find a map at one point, still the same, because the sun is vastly older than anything, even civilizations that have risen and gone extinct thousands of years before you were born, which is its own kind of sense of wonder generation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I mean is so in Hardlight, there's this one chamber where it talks about these crystalline growths, and these crystalline growths have grown up and grown in a certain way over the course of millennia. And I think if this was a medieval fantasy dungeon, the characters would see those crystalline growths and they might wonder about them, but ultimately it's just an obstacle to sort of traverse. Whereas in this context, in the context of science fiction, the player characters might be able to plausibly figure out what those crystalline growths are and how old they are and how they came to be. And so I think you just have to be ready for that.
Oh yeah, and absolutely. And that's why one of my Chain Lightning items is that thing about being the first to discover what's going on. I think there's the fact that there's actually that possibility of genuinely finding out is, yeah, you're right, that's really important, especially I think for the harder SF subgenre. You know, in Star Wars, you're not going to go finding out about some ancient temple, but in something like The Sparrow or some kind of Arthur C. Clarke-y hardback 1960s novel, then you would. So yeah, that's definitely part of it. And it gives you as well something that we talked about discussing Leviathan, that idea of being a competent science and engineering kind of person. You know, your character is good at analysing and finding things out, perhaps, and then you actually do it in this scenario. Whereas, like you say, in a fantasy dungeon, you can, but you're not really operating in the same mindset.
The other thing that I wanted to kind of highlight is something I found fascinating when we're talking about the Ushans and the Chittics, is that they completely misunderstand each other. Like, they totally, completely misunderstand each other as species. And I think that this feels like a particular kind of science fiction setting issue, because in a fantasy setting, everything is like a little bit closer because of the presumed limits of technology. Orcs have always been on the border. Goblins have always been over here, and we've always had to deal with them, and we understand each other, at least to some degree, right? We might have our prejudices and everything, or biases, but ultimately we know what an orc is. We know what these things are. Unless we go to the very, very deep part of the dungeons where the truly alien things live, we understand certain things. And when the species of a fantasy realm mesh together or clash together, they have certain understandings, they have long simmering resentments and all this kind of stuff. In the case of science fiction, you can have a species that is totally unheard of by the other species, that traveled here who knows how many space miles or whatever to get there, and they have no knowledge of each other, and that has an effect on like how they interact. And you can see that playing out in the Sky Tombs, right? You can see this sort of unfamiliarity, like in their cultures, like really playing out in a big way. And that just feels like something you should highlight in your science fiction dungeon.
Yeah, definitely. Because even when you do encounter that kind of, here's a totally alien menace thing in fantasy, you often find yourself thinking, well, this feels a bit like a science fiction creature dropped into Lord of the Rings or whatever. So
yeah, exactly.
So you're right. And I think probably the example of Hard Light is the kind of the best way, as you've expressed it during the basic rule, like the best way to convey that, rather than having them on screen and visibly being there, having conversations past each other or interactions. This idea of what they leave behind, showing how they didn't get each other and how they were completely incompatible, basically. I think that's... why does that work more? I guess it's because the players have to put the pieces together themselves, and that is how you lock things into your... It's showing and not telling.
Yeah, I think that's right. Anyway, those were my big observations as a sort of like unseasoned science fiction dungeoneer. I don't really qualify for the expert delve today, but but you know, I guess the fact that people are listening makes me the expert, right?
Exactly.
Tom, what do you think?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure that I'm that much more qualified, because I don't know, if you think of the three things in our sci-fi trilogy so far as being on a spectrum, with I would say Leviathan at one end, about physical items and moving them around, Orbital Blues at the other being all about characters, and then Hard Light's kind of in the middle. I'm very much on the Orbital Blues end, I would say. I like
me too. Yeah,
I like a cool spaceship, but yeah, basically I think I could spend all my time on Brightside Station within Hard Light. But having said that, even I think with limited technical knowledge as I have, and I'm guessing an average number of people listening do, I do think there's something about technical solutions and equipment, using your machinery and technology to solve problems or to handle things, that's also important. So like in at the Cold Tomb, right, the flooded dungeon, in a fantasy game you'd have some kind of nonsensical magic ring to help you go deal with that, or you just wouldn't deal with it, you just hold your breath. But in this, you get spacesuits, and you can't, because of the radiation, you can't use your radios. So you actually have to use wires or lasers. So, like, you have to connect it to each other by phone wires, basically, which is in a way very low tech, but in the other very because it's a technology solution, it feels grounded. Even though I'm not totally convinced. I don't know how much research was done on the physical properties of this radiation. It could easily be a massive hand wave. But that's the thing. Right. All you need to do is invent an effect and then say, the insert Greek letter here, radiation has effect X. And then, you're done. You're just trying to find ways around your fictional radiation problem. And I think the design mechanism for that is, again, it's a bit of a reskin. You think of, if you're not a technical science guy, just think of how you would do it in a fantasy game, what the fun problem would be, and then come up with something. Hit Wikipedia for some vaguely good explanations.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're probably done. Apologies to my friend Jay, who's probably listening to this and tearing his hair out, going, "Look, why don't you just model it?" But no, I think there's a threshold of just about believability, and even people who actually know what they're talking about with, say, orbital physics will.
I'm glad you brought that up because, when I was thinking about this, I don't think accurately conveying science is necessary, right? Like, no. It doesn't feel like a pressing issue. I know it will be for some people. It is not for me. I think that's why when I was kind of considering the topic, I was really thinking about themes. I was really thinking about thematic concerns, like thematically what makes the science fiction dungeon. So that's where my thinking goes, because as in everything in tabletop role-playing games, to some degree, all we're really doing is just trying to impart a feeling more than we're trying to impart information. And this is where the rubber really hits the road in that idea, because I am alienated by the information in, say, Leviathan, whereas I am enthralled by the feeling in Hard Light, right? And it's a distinction, right? It's a distinct way of presenting the setting, and there are going to be those people who are really into this sort of like very accurate, almost simulationist like approach to this, but I don't think that's fun personally, and it's not for me. I like the thread that Stars Without Number is doing here, like it just feels like it's just sciencey enough to make me suspend the rest of my disbelief and then just kind of get into the fun details, so I'm here for that. And I think that's the way you approach this, right? I think you have to think about themes. I really think it's important to think about just like the vastness of space and what that means for the dungeon. Like, I think if you sort of explore that idea in some way, I think you're in good shape.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one issue that came up in our game that I think really encapsulates how that's worked really well in Hard Light, which I think is a model I will be stealing for, and which I think you could reskin to, say, for example, the Age of Sail differently. And that is the thing with the radiation is to do with the long distances. So you're talking days of travel from the station and safety to the tombs and back. And the issue we had was, you're exploring a tomb, that's going to take you some time. And normally in fantasy games, you're thinking about rations or torches.
Sure.
But here we had, your spacecraft can survive for, I think it's a bit over a day before the shielding gives out and you start to die of radiation poisoning. And then you start to have these fraught decisions about how long can we risk staying out here? Because if we have an accident and have to get back, it's not that we won't make it back to the spacecraft. You get the very science fiction thing of, we'll get back to the spacecraft and we'll set off across the vast unknowable chasms of space for safety, and we will start to die about 3 hours before we get back. So, and that, I think, was that kind of conversation that the characters were having was, I mean, it's perfect. It's like old school dungeon delving, but it's also this very life and death character driven, like, because there's more adventurous ones, there's more cautious ones, and then it has that sort of technical challenge as well, in the sense of figuring out how many hours can we stay. Look at this meter that's slowly ticking down. It was very kind of dramatic, even though it was just a conversation. It wasn't like the bit where they were attacked by robots was arguably less exciting than that whole conversation about what they were doing. So I think it's a really good simple example that doesn't require loads of SF genre knowledge or real world scientific knowledge, just a kind of knowledge of what decisions are hard to make and what themes are at play in the scenario.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I gel with that completely. But I'm curious, how easy do you think it is to take an existing fantasy dungeon and make it into a science fiction dungeon? Is there a consideration beyond just mere reskinning? Is there something else that needs to take place? What do you think?
I think it is harder than it looks.
Okay.
Because I've certainly used a floor plan from a dungeon or two. I did the Maze of Neuromen. I used that in Stars Without Number.
Right.
But when it's a reskin, it does always feel... It doesn't feel like un-sci-fi in the sense that, in space they also have office buildings and we don't really worry about that. But it does not feel science fiction-y in the same way that, for example, Hard Light does or Leviathan does. And you definitely have to do something extra, and I don't think that I have a consistent method for doing that. I have a feeling that, in a similar way, like if you were doing a hard-boiled detective game, you couldn't just take Hard Light and use it actually, maybe you could. No, but yeah, you couldn't use the Sky Tombs.
I mean, embezzlement and stuff. Like,
I feel
like you could do that whole station part,
But the Sky Tombs wouldn't be very, very useful, even though like the maps, maybe they would be if you're exploring something. But yeah, so there is something about the motivations at play, I guess, and the spaces that you're interacting with. I think reskin fantasy dungeons do work, but if you want them to be really good sci-fi gaming, you need to come in with something, maybe a completely unrelated idea as well, this idea of doubling up the use of space.
Yeah.
Narratively speaking, you could do that too. You need to come in with something totally new. In my experience, it does not work as well as it could in that kind of dream ideal sci-fi dungeon.
The sort of interesting like inverse of it in a way, though, is that I know for a fact that you've run lots of traditional fantasy dungeons using that game with the Space Marines.
Stay Frosty, yeah.
Stay Frosty, yeah. That's kind of like an inverse thing because it's like Space Marines going into a planet where presumably you didn't do much reskinning, like it's just the dungeon.
Right? No, yeah, it's Fever Swamp, wasn't it? But that I think is partly because Aliens isn't really, like the bits with the Marines aren't that science fiction-y. There's no kind of
fair. Yeah, that's
genre
fair.
difference between. But that's a good point as well.
I just wondered to some degree how much is landing on a planet and exploring that planet just like that planet's version of a fantasy dungeon, like that's their fantasy.
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
The Star Trek travel model is pretty similar to Jason and the Argonauts or the Odyssey in a way. You land on an island, they're having a sacred games, they've got a weird monster. Yeah, actually,
precisely. Yeah.
Well.
So I think that's a consideration as well.
Yeah, true.
Anything else you want to say about this topic?
Not really. I think this is more one of those exploratory discussions than we actually have a plan here. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Looking back, I guess, across the 3 episodes we've done recently, I do think each of them provides an interesting and really viable model for good sci-fi gaming. And actually, what I was doing when I ran a Hard Light was effectively episode 2 of that same campaign. So I think one of the great things about planet hopping adventures, or indeed island hopping ancient Greek adventures, is you can kind of change the model that you're using every time. So I think they will have something to teach us. Leviathan maybe less than the rest because that's a lot of prep.
Yeah,
if you rewrite Leviathan, and actually so is Orbital Blues, even though it doesn't look like it on the page necessarily. Whereas I think Hard Light, being between the two, that's maybe more in the skill set of the gamer in general, including me, I would say. Like, I think I could do something like Hard Light.
I think I could too.
Reasonably easily, whereas the others are a bit more challenging.
Indeed. Well, let's go to companion adventures. It's companion adventures. Let's talk about our films. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got The Abyss from 1989, starring, is it Ed Harris and various people? Which is the James Cameron film that isn't The Terminator or Titanic, but it does have some CGI shape-shifting creatures and sunken vessels, so between the two. It's like about the submarine crew who encounter aliens under the sea, and it has that whole, like exploring strange, unknowable species. In this case, the aliens do show up, spoiler warning. But it has that whole, first contact scenario thing going for it. And, of course, being under the crushing depth of water, much like in Hard Light.
I have Prometheus from 2012, which is part of the Alien franchise of movies. In some ways, not the best movie in the world, if I'm being honest, but visually and design-wise, aesthetically, quite impressive, and really stands in well for the idea of an incredibly ancient, extinct civilization, alien civilization.
Nice. My other film is less for the aliens and space exploration part, and more for the grim and gritty mining drama, which is Blind Shaft from 2003, Mung Jing, which is based on a novel that I've not read, and it's about these 2 deadly con artists going around the coal mines, I think they're coal mines, of central northern China, and basically what they do is they sign up to work at a mine, they'll befriend someone who works there and claim to be his relative, then they will stage an accident killing that guy and claim the insurance. That's their thing. They do it going from town to town. And it's this very, by the way, it's pretty slow. If you like a long stationary shot, watching a vehicle slowly approach camera, good news. But it's like very dusty, grim, grimy, and pretty bleak. So perfect for a night in with friends.
I have a video game, which is a fairly new video game, Returnal, 2021 PS5 exclusive, one of the first PS5 games worth playing. It is a space game about a woman who crash lands on a planet, a very hostile planet, and she dies over and over again and comes back over and over again, and she's just like reliving this like space crash, right, and trying to survive on this planet. The game is hard as fuck. It's so hard. I want to like scream sometimes, but if you can stick with it, it is sumptuous and beautiful, and like Prometheus, it kind of really stands in for this idea of like an ancient, extinct alien civilization. It's just really, really something to look at. I think other video games also do this really nicely. The Metroid Prime series, for example, does a really, really nice job of like presenting, I think they're called the Chozo or something like that, this extinct alien species, which is kind of like what you're getting in the Sky Tombs.
All right.
And then music, I guess.
Yeah, music. So, well, I thought we hadn't had much electronica for a while, so now I think we both are doing it this episode. So my one is the album 604 by Ladytron from 2001, which is, I think it's good for a bit of, it would be good for your landing on the planet montages. You know, it's got sort of menacing organ sounds and then bloopy synthesizers and space radio interference noises here and there. And the absolute banger single that is Playgirl, one of the best cowbell-heavy singles released, I think. How about you?
Fantastic. I've got Zeit by Tangerine Dream, 1972, I would say album, but it's just 4 tracks. They're like 4 roughly 20-minute tracks. And for a lot of the same reasons, it's just this like, it's a little maybe more spare than your selection, but it feels spacey. It's just got lots of like dissonant sounds and maybe kind of hard to find melodies, but once you do, like they're pretty cool. And what I think is particularly interesting about this is because each track is about 20 minutes, if you're one of those people who likes to have background ambiance going, these are pretty good lengths, like, to kind of throw them on there. That's not my thing, but I've always enjoyed this work, and this seems like a good episode to throw it out there.
Yeah, nice.
And with that, that's our show. Listeners, Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. The website is gauntlet-rpg.com. If you'd like to support the show financially, please do so at patreon.com/gauntlet. In either case, please rate and review Fear of a Black Dragon wherever you get your podcasts at. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks to our astronomical editor, Rich Rogers.
You messed up the E thing, though. That's not E.
No, it's just it's vowel openings.
No, it's always an E. Okay.
Go back and re-listen, Jason. It's not always an E.
Isn't it always an E? Okay, well, anyway. All right. Take care.
Goodbye.
Can you hear the footsteps in the shadows? Can you smell the metal tang of blood on the air? Can you feel the veil between worlds slipping away with each heartbeat? The Between is here. The Between is a tabletop role-playing game about a group of mysterious monster hunters in Victorian-era London. These hunters learn about monsters and killers throughout the city and conduct investigations in order to neutralize them. Over time, they become aware of the plans of a criminal mastermind who is pulling the strings behind the scenes. They will eventually be forced to confront this mastermind in order to save Queen and Country. The Between is directly inspired by the TV show Penny Dreadful, but also takes inspiration from British horror classics, the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, pulp-era media, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and from Hell. It's powered by the Apocalypse and uses the mystery system from our hit game Brindlewood Bay. The Between comes with a 129-page rulebook, 7 playbooks, 10 scenarios or threats, a mastermind campaign sheet, reference sheets, and a supplement called London at Night, The Unseen. The Between PDF is available now on the Gauntlet Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/gauntlet. The Between will be available on DriveThru RPG starting June 14th.